If you ignore emerging risks, sooner or later, one will surprise you. But keeping track of emerging risk is very different than everyday risk management of what I sometimes call the presenting risks. That's why emerging risks get their own risk management time zone. Hello, and welcome to the 88th Crossing Thin Ice podcast. Today, I am joined, as always, by Max Rudolph. This is Max's 19th podcast where he has focused our attention on emerging risks. This time, the focus is on the general process of emerging risk management. Before we start, I need to mention that nothing in this podcast is investment advice. We hope that it will be a stimulating educational discussion for risk managers. Let's get started.
An emerging risk generates uncertain results that are hard to recognize and model. This can be due to cognitive bias, for example, when a recurring risk like a pandemic or earthquake hasn't happened lately, like recency bias. Or it can be technology improvements that increase productivity. Third method is when a risk evolves, like global warming, leading to extreme events, tipping points, and feedback loops. The impacts can be positive surprises or cascading failures. Emerging risks and general uncertainty require analysts to incorporate a margin of safety into their assumptions. Each emerging risk contributes to what I call an unknown known, where historical data is no longer predictive. Stakeholders anchor, using another cognitive bias, on statistical data to model the future. Few risks today generate assumptions that are not evolving in some way, either from novel outcomes, nonlinear trends, or discontinuities. It's important for models to consider emerging risks when viewing the impact of tail events. Model analysis depends on the time horizon, severity, and velocity of the risk impact. A risk like the sun's eventual death or a large meteor impact can be ignored since the result overwhelms all outcomes. Some risk events have time horizons over 100 years from now. Still important, but for them, a qualitative analysis may be enough. A likely risk with minimal severity can be ignored or built into the base assumption, while those that can quickly accelerate, like an earthquake, should be included due to velocity. Liquidity risk exposure is a good example where creativity should be considered, since the risk builds quietly and can quickly expand into a high severity event. Evolving risks are the most common, but corporate culture may push back after discovery. For example, interest rates have ranged from a few basis points to nearly 20% just in my lifetime. Many financial risks are cyclical. Why are we surprised when they reach typical extremes? Foresight is the key to success when evaluating emerging risks across longer time horizons. Scanning for these risks is hard, but becomes more familiar for those who already have a process on their radar. Many risk managers miss changes because they rely on rules of thumb for frequency and severity from historical data, rather than using scenario testing and first principles to generate a range of outcomes that align with the desired risk appetite. Incorporating complex interactions with new risks can be very challenging. Insurers need to consider cash flow mismatches between assets and liabilities across a variety of time horizons. If a liability has a short duration guarantee, like car insurance, the assets should be liquid, but extend with little interest rate risk. But if the liability has a long duration, like long-term care or pension risk transfer products, the asset cash flows are shorter or uncertain due to an emerging risk, this can be a future solvency issue. Single premium products are especially susceptible since they lack opportunities to generate additional revenue from the policyholder. For example, a long-term care insurer should not back its policies with 30-year mortgages written in regions that may become unsustainable due to global warming-driven emerging risks like hurricanes or sea level rise. Guarantees that extend beyond 10 years should increase margins of safety, but competitors are unlikely to recognize or price for these risks. Demographics provide a good example as they interact with most other risks, acting as a force multiplier that increases standalone impacts and makes historical data less relevant. The age distribution of populations is fairly well defined for the next few years, but impacts financial, social, and technological risks as debt levels, interest rates, and societal pressures encourage change. While negative outcomes are more common, an example of positive interactions results from technology on productivity gains and infrastructure grid efficiencies. Global warming provides a good example why it's important to look at multiple time horizons. Much like demographics, the impact of global warming is mostly known for the next 5 to 10 years. More extreme weather events will occur and temperatures will warm, especially in El Nino years. This has a cost and will increase property losses that can be anticipated. Over longer periods, interactions with financial assumptions will pressure inflation and risk-free rates while also raising spreads on risky assets. Getting it right is not important just for the private sector. During the COVID-19 pandemic, had governments globally not bailed out economies by flooding cash into an already highly leveraged situation, and had the virus focus mortality on prime age adults like it did a century ago, insurer survival would have been at risk. This is the scenario that should be tested going forward. Challenges identified by models for one risk combination will often provide clues to deal with other emerging risks. Sometimes it's better to be lucky, and models should be reviewed regularly. A recent example provides clarification. Pandemic operational exposure to service insurance policies was dependent on work from home, which would not have been possible just a few years earlier. Improved Wi-Fi and aggregate bandwidth allowed policies to be serviced, while stay-at-home policies were in place that would not have been possible 10 years ago. On the flip side, ever higher levels of debt make a future aggressive pandemic response less likely to succeed. What other emerging risks are we more or less prepared for today? I've been talking a lot lately about the importance of stability to maintain the world as we know it, building resilience and reducing fragility. Rules of thumb need to be tested, often by reverting to first principles and current expectations of the future. Emerging risks are a key component of this analysis, interacting with risks where historical data is not predictive. For financial entities like an insurance company, anticipating the impact of these future risk exposures will determine the winners and losers in a competitive market.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Max. That was great stuff. As you know, I'm a big fan of your work on emerging risks. Many listeners will be familiar with the ideas of frequency and severity that you mentioned, but what do you mean by velocity in an emerging risk context?
Thanks, Dave. The short answer is how fast an event can go wrong. High velocity risk events would include earthquakes, electrical grid failure, or a cyber attack. Low velocity events are often associated with demographics, regulations, or something like aquifer depletion. With these, you have some time to react. One problem associated with low velocity events is that your competitors might not recognize them even if you do. And that makes your price uncompetitive, and many years need to pass before you're proven right. Regulators can help there, as they did 20 years ago, when pandemics had been recognized as a solvency risk and a capital charge was added by the NAIC. Unfortunately, the pandemic stress tests that focused on quantitative measures were found wanting. We know now that a narrative scenario, including impact on morbidity, that starts at different times during the calendar year deductible period, mortality focused on various age groups, economic impacts, and strains on assets should all be considered. How many insurers, or any company for that matter, had tested a full work from home scenario that lasted for a year? Those that tested power outage or flood scenarios requiring the office to be closed for a week were probably at an advantage. Developing an early warning system, especially for high velocity events, will provide time to react to the worst outcomes.
That's great, Max. I guess I worked with one company where the big issue for them when we did a pandemic stress scenario was sick time for their service employees. That particular company's key objective was getting their service right, and they weren't sure how they could maintain their service standards if 10% of their workforce was out sick at any one time. Max, you've written a number of papers and essays about global warming and climate change. How did you come to look at that emerging risk?
Well, I'll admit that I grew up quite naive. While Jim Hansen was presenting to Congress in 1988, I assumed the government would protect me, as they had with the ozone issue just shortly before that. Temperatures spiked in 1997. I noticed that. Now we know it's due to a large El Nino event, and I thought nothing of it. As temperatures dropped in the years following, the argument that it was a random event, an outlier, seemed reasonable. What I've since come to understand is the outsized impact that El Ninos have, and that we should compare El Nino years only to others in that data set, with non El Nino years forming a separate data set. I was involved, as you were, Dave, in the rollout of ERM in the actuarial profession starting in 2012, and I attended several casualty meetings as a result of that. The actuaries I spoke to recognized that the higher property claims they were seeing in their data was due to a warming planet and weather events that created. They left it to climate scientists to tell them why, and follow-ups led me to learn quite a bit more about greenhouse gases and their role. It took another 10 years before a majority of life and health actuaries agreed, and there's still a few who challenge the science today. I've found that there are specific talking points used by deniers, and they can often be readily fact checked. The key for me has been to focus on the impact rather than the why. If claims are higher or yields lower, I need to adjust my assumptions no matter the reason. I try to be skeptical, that's healthy, but my own reading shows too many feedback loops and tipping points being reached. Start with albedo and El Ninos, and you'll find yourself scanning warming and other emerging risks on a regular basis. Global warming is not a switch that will turn on and reach a new equilibrium. It will continue to evolve until it reaches that new steady state many years from now. In addition to extreme weather, as glaciers melt, seasonal freshwater and sea level rise will drive climate migration away from places like Florida, Bangladesh, and Beijing.
Yeah, I really it was fascinated when I learned about the feedback loop idea. And in particular, the types of feedback loops I found the most interesting were feedback loops where you had significantly delayed information about what was going on with the loop. So that when it came around to you to react to it, you were reacting to information that was out of date. That caused oscillation in the loops, which is something that we saw with the pandemic responses, and I imagine we'll see it as things go forward and the climate effects get more and more obvious. There's also the issue with emerging risks of cognitive biases in how we look at historical data. How can risk managers effectively unlearn recency bias when historical data actively misleads them about low frequency, high severity tail events?
I think our focus is always on looking at the quantitative numbers. And I think the way to avoid that risk is to start by looking at the data. If you graph it, does the most recent data look like the years prior? If not, if the trend is linear, you might be able to use finite differences to extrapolate. Compare the difference between the results, maybe from the most recent 5 years and the 5 years prior to that, and then add that difference to the most recent data to estimate the next 5 years. If growth has been exponential, then obviously a linear average to use to price is not going to be successful, but other mathematical estimates can be made.
I guess we do have a tendency to think of trend as a linear thing, a first order difference. How does corporate culture factor into this? How does the culture frequently push back against the recognition of evolving risks? And how can leadership incentivize internal challenge to establish rules of thumb?
The way we've always done it is one barrier. We've been successful in the past, so why change it now? Another is various fiefdoms. Why are you stepping on my turf? Leadership needs to encourage communication so different teams interact regularly. I like to have a risk team with members from each product management area. They present to each other, ask others for their opinions, and a nice side benefit is that familiarity between these groups can aid in succession planning.
Well, let's move on, Max. and talk about additional issues here, like time horizons, velocity modeling. How should analysts weigh that velocity idea versus severity when they're deciding whether a high impact risk requires immediate quantitative modeling or simple qualitative review?
Yeah, this is part of the prioritization process. A formula is developed that incorporates frequency and severity, and velocity can be dropped in as well. With a 1 to 5 scale for each, I typically see formulas like frequency plus 2 times severity or frequency times severity. In the resulting chart, what I like to do is make the data point be sized based on velocity so that you get that information in there as well. And then once you make a first pass, you want to peer review the ranking. You may need to adjust a couple of times that formula before you're happy with it based on what you think about the risk. I think it's valuable for a firm to work on risk projects with varying time horizons as well. I think that helps to reduce surprises so that you're not always focused on just what the risks are over the next year. Dave, I've got a question for you. In what ways can scenario testing and first principles thinking be used to examine complex interactions between new risks that traditional frequency and severity metrics miss?
Well, that's a great question, Max. And that kind of gets to the heart of looking at emerging risks because we don't necessarily know what's going to happen with emerging risks. We have to speculate. And so often going back to first principles is a great way of speculating and sort of tearing apart the possible situations. And we then need to use things like the feedback loops that you've mentioned, which part of systems thinking. System thinking looks at things like feedback loops and interconnections between things. Using that systems thinking and the first principles on an emerging risks, you can then construct a scenario, and then with that scenario, you can test to see what impact that might have on the company. So that's kind of the process that you would go through there. Let's look at some issues related to macro trends and systemic resilience. How does shifting global demographics act as a force multiplier when interacting with technological disruption, debt levels, and climate change over the coming decades?
The developed world is aging with below replacement fertility rates and longer lifespans. This means fewer workers are required to support more retirees. This has ramifications for inflation due to high demand for workers and reduced yields as seniors spend down their assets. Dollars needed for social safety nets will compete with interest payments, defense spending, and payments to replace destroyed infrastructure from global warming. Immigration can be a partial solution if welcomed by and integrated into the existing population.
Yeah, I think this one, Max, has an interesting offset to one of the emerging risks that I pay a lot of attention to, which is the risks that people keep mentioning that AI is going to come along and take away a lot of jobs, with the demographic pull in the other direction, in addition to the fact that because of the demographics change, there will be a lot of new jobs created in elder care, for instance. I think that the demographic story helps to offset that emerging risk.
Yeah, I'm always reminded of the period before we had automobiles, where 25% of all the jobs, at least in the United States, were tied to horses. And over probably less than 20 years, that changed to where, now almost, very low percentage are even in the agricultural industry. So those people, it's difficult for people when it happens to you. The economy in general has shown in the past that it's been able to adjust over time. It's just a matter of how, it's that velocity. How quickly is the risk going to play out?
Yeah, we don't talk about it very much, but I think that was one of the things that played into the Great Depression was that the people that had been in agricultural jobs, one of the stories I think we've mentioned in one of our earlier podcasts was how government benefits that were given to farmers were used to buy tractors. which reduce the need for farmhands. Lots of moving parts there. Considering how technological advancements like remote work infrastructure saved our pandemic era operations, what major emerging risks are currently less prepared for despite technological progress?
Yeah, thanks, Dave. This is an interesting question, and there are many, and I'll be interested to hear any you want to add to this discussion. While building codes have improved for hurricanes and earthquakes over the years, too many times existing property is grandfathered when the rules change, so that risk is out there. I worry in particular about a subduction zone earthquake near Seattle that generates a large tsunami with little time to prepare. We talked about that in our 14th podcast way back in 2023. I also believe we are less prepared for a pandemic than before 2020. At that time, food supply chains adjusted so quickly that shortages became inconveniences rather than catastrophes. A pandemic that strikes down prime age workers would have ramifications not in anybody's current scenario plans.
One technological emerging risk that is getting a lot of discussion lately, I'm not sure it's getting any action, is that of cognitive decline based on reliance on AI. What many studies are showing is that it doesn't take very long at all for people to start losing capabilities by surrendering their work over to AI, and those can be regained. It's kind of like, you stopped going to the gym. Your muscles react very quickly to that, but they can bounce back again if you start going back to the gym again.
Many historical events seem to cycle, returning again to historical practices that rhyme, as Mark Twain used to say. We seem to be in a period where many of these cycles are turning over, as Neil Howe calls it, the fourth turning. Many risks tied to war and socioeconomic crises occur during this time, and it seems to be at least in part a cognitive bias because an event has not happened in most living people's lifetime. Today, most of us in the U.S. have not lived in fear of terrorism or of war impacting us directly. The greatest generation isn't around to remind us how hard war is, even when you win, or how poorly minorities are often treated. We spend with abandon and assume we can act without consequences. There will be a bill to pay at some point in the near future. The best case, I think, is a strong recession. We certainly need to prepare for that personally as well as in our businesses.
Thanks for listening today. Here are my suggestions for takeaways from this talk. Number one, emerging risks create nonlinear, hard-to-predict outcomes driven by cognitive biases, technology changes, or evolving phenomena like global warming. Number two, relying solely on historical frequency and severity metrics leads to blind spots regarding tail events. And number three, organizational resistance, such as siloed teams or reliance on past successes, often prevents emerging risks from being addressed. We hope that you learned something from this podcast, and if you enjoyed it, please like, subscribe, and share with your coworkers. Thanks. Bye.